On this computer.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight's shiur, as usual, Dov Ber Meir Ben Reuven Halevi Imi Marati Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And this Shabbos we're reading parshat Terumah, which deals with primarily the design and the contributions for the Mishkan, the traveling sanctuary that was to accompany Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar, and the part we're going to deal with tonight is the Kerashim, the walls, the boards that form the walls of the Mishkan, the inner portion, as opposed to the outer portion of the sanctuary, which was enclosed by curtains. The inner is enclosed by a wall, which is covered with curtains. We're going to be talking about the boards that make up the wall tonight and the formation of the wall. So it's going to be a little bit different than usual. We're going to go to some psukim first, then we're going to actually have, I'm going to digress for a while to look at some of the schematics of way people have envisioned that these boards look like, and then perhaps we will have enough time to get back to some of the parshanut on what's going on. So we'll start with psukim. Again, this is Perek Chavav in Shmot, starting with pasuk Tedvav, and it talks about the Kerashim, Vasitot HaKerashim LaMishkan, and you should make the boards for the Mishkan. Atzei Shitim Omdim, they are to be made from standing cedar wood, or Shitim wood, I guess. I shouldn't say cedar. Arazim is some type of tree, Shitim, but whatever it's translated as. Esra amot orach hakarish. Each of these boards was to be 10 amot long, the amma v'chatzi amma rocha v'kerish echad, and 1.5 amot was the width of the kerish. Now, there's a little problem here. There's a third dimension missing. This is a three-dimensional object. The third dimension is blank. We know it's 10 high or 10 long by 1.5 wide. We don't know what the depth or thickness of these boards was. So it makes it a little challenging. We'll see what the Parshanim have to say about that as we get into this. Each of these boards or planks or whatever you'd like to call them is to have 2 yadot, 2 handles or hands. Mishulavot, they are to be joined or somehow work together. Isha alachota, each one to the other. Kenta said, so you should make l'chol karshei mishkan for each of the boards of the Mishkan. So each board is 10 amot high, 1.5 amot wide. We don't know the thickness, but we know that it has 2 yadot somewhere, 2 handles somewhere. When you make the Kerashim for the Mishkan, Esrim Kerish, there will be 20 of these Lifat Negba Temana for the Negba, the south side of the Mishkan should have 20 of these boards. Arboim Adne Kesef Tasetach Adashim Koresh. There should be 40 Adanim, which are generally translated as sockets or foundation, basis. That there are 40 of those to be made beneath the 20 Kerashim. There are 2 Adanim for each Keresh. So if you've got 20 boards, 40 Adanim, the ratio is 2 to 1. And what is the purpose of these Adanim is there are 2 Adanim beneath each Keresh for its 2 handles. And again, for the next Keresh, they're the same thing. So each of these 20 Kerashim were held in place by 2 Adanim, which held the 2 Yadot. We're going to see how all this goes together hopefully. Uletel Mishkan Hashenit, on the opposite side of the Mishkan, Lifat Tzafon. Remember, if you've got the south wall and the north wall, obviously would be opposite it. Also, Esrim Karish, there are 20 boards on the north side. Rabbi Madam Kesef, the same thing. They also had 40 of these sockets of silver. Again, 2 Adonim beneath each of the Kerashim for the 20 Kerashim that are on the north side. For the western side of the Mishkan, there are to be 6 Kerashim, because the north side is from north to south, is the narrow part of the Mishkan. From east to west is the wider part. So the north and south walls are the longer walls. The east wall doesn't exist. The west wall is a shorter wall, and it consists of only 6 Kerashim plus Shnei Kerashim Taseh. You have to make 2 Kerashim Limikutzot HaMishkan for the corners of the Mishkan B'Yarachatayim on each of the 2 corners. So the northeast, northwest, and southwest corner each have 1 pole. So there are a total of 8, not 6, on the west side, and 20 on each of the north and south side. Again, the east side is the open side where the entrance to the Mishkan is. Now, they should be parallel, they should be even from below. The Yachtav, and together, Yutamim al Rosho, they should come to a conclusion, a point at the head. And there they reach a ring. There is a ring at the top of these poles. This should be for the 2 corner posts. You that are on the 2 corners. The 2 corners all are to square off the whole building, as we'll see as we get to some of the drawings here. But you Shmona Kerashim. So therefore, since we had 6 plus the 2 corner ones, total of 8. Vadehem Kesef. They all again also have silver Adanim, silver sockets. Shisha Adanim. There are 16 for the 8 poles. So the total we have so far is 48 Kerashim and 96 Adanim. You have to make brichim, which I will say as stability poles. Briach is a pole, but these are for stability. For each side of the Mishkan, there should be 5 of these poles. So both on the north and south, there are to be 5 of these poles, as well as on the west. Each side had 5 poles. Now, there's also, in addition to that, there's a habriach hatichon b'toch hakrashim. There is one of these, according to most parshanim, of these 5 is the middle briach b'toch hakrashim that went in the middle of the krashim. Actually went through. There is a hole drilled in the middle of each keresh, width wise, that will go through the width of them. So when they line up, there's a one hole in the middle, that there is a pole that goes through the middle. It should go min hakotzel from one end of the wall to the other end of the wall. The et hakrashim titzapeh zahav. The krashim are to be coated in gold. The tabotehem taseh zahav, and you have to provide with them with rings of gold. Batim labrichim, which in addition to the thing what we talked about on top, the tabaot on top, we have tabaot on the side that are batim labrichim. Those are to house the poles, and then v'tipito tabrichim zahav. The poles are to be coated gold, and there's a difference of opinion as to whether the poles themselves are coated gold or the fact that they sit in these rings that are gold makes them plated with gold. And then you should construct the Mishkan as you were shown in the on Har Sinai. I guess Hashem showed Moshe somehow through Nevuah how all of this was going to be put together. So now I'm going to stop the text for a minute, and we're going to go to some visual aids here, which I hope will aid. Okay, we're going to start with a very simple black and white diagramic of what a pole looked like. So, Mark, you may want to move over here. It'll probably be a little easier for you to see. I don't know how the glare works from there. Okay, but if we look at here, this by the way is just I have to give the proper accreditation, otherwise I'm plagiarizing, right? So this comes from the Stone Chumash. If you happen to have one, I don't know the page, but it's a Stone Chumash illustration. I probably, if I went found further enough, I have the whole page copied here. But okay, you'll notice this showing two of the Kerashim side by side, right here in the middle. You have a pole here on the top holding them together, a pole on the bottom holding them together, and here you see the pole in the middle where there's a hole drilled, is that middle pole that we talked about that goes all along the length. We're going to discuss later how we get to 5 total poles. If it looks here, it looks like there are only 3 poles on each wall. If I look at this drawing, but Psukim said that there were 5 poles. So we'll see in a minute how we get to the 5 poles. You'll notice at the top there is a ring. It is I think it's a square ring generally, except on the corners where it's a little bit different. But this ring goes through a slight hole that is chiseled out, carved out at the top of each of the poles. Each have, you'll notice, 2 slits in it at the top, and a ring goes over this and holds the 2 tops together. That's how they are attached on top. The bottom, they have what we call the yadot. Here he translates it as tenons. Don't ask me what that means. What? T-N-O-N, tenon. Yeah, that's what he writes here. I mean, okay. David, my expert here on the... So you did what? Woodwork. Oh, David, woodwork. Okay, this is a woodwork term, tenons. David said this is a woodwork term. Okay, it's an extension from a piece of wood used to attach it to something else. It's similar to the way we might use today a dowel to attach a couple of pieces together. But this is, rather than being a separate piece, it is carved out and it is part of the actual keresh itself. Yes, they're a pain in the neck to chisel out the wood and get it even and nice looking, and you have to have the right tools to do it. And to be within the tolerance level of the hole it's got to go into. Correct. Okay, but this is, as I said, just a general overview of how the whole keresh looked, and just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. And now I'm going to go to the next drawing, if we can. Computer will let me. And we're going to go through each of the different things and see how to give you an idea of what the different things are. Now, first we start with the poles itself. Now, remember I mentioned that the Torah does not give us a thickness dimension. Okay, it tells us that they're 10 amot high, tells us they're 1.5 amot wide along the width of the wall, but it doesn't tell us how thick they are from front to back. Okay, now, Rabbi Nehemiah, in the Mishnah says that they were 1 amma thick from top to bottom. They were uniform thickness throughout. So they were, again, each pole is 10 amot high. However, it's not really 10 amot. It's really only 9 amot, because the bottom amma, the lowest amma, is these 2 poles, 2 tenons that are carved out, the 2 yadot, the 2 handles, or which attach them. Those 2 go up to a height of 1 amma. So really, from here till the top is only 9 amot, because it includes, the 10 amot includes the yad. So it's 10 by 1.5 by a thickness of 1, according to Rabbi Nehemiah. Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, it was 1 amma width at the bottom, but it tapers off in both directions from top to bottom, so that at the top it's only a finger breadth thick, 1 finger thick. So it's not thickness. It's not a solid plank going up. It is a graduated angled plank going upwards. And there is 2 opinions in Rashi where the angling, in Tosfos, where the angling starts. You'll notice the left-hand side one, it stays thick till about a third to a half of the way up, and then starts tapering off. In the right-hand one, it tapers from the top to bottom. So those are 2 different opinions. Most the drawings that are done seem to follow Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion, and there's a reason to, if we go through the different trying to reconcile how the Mishkan looked, it's a lot easier to do it with squares than it is with the tapering, in terms of how the curtains lied, how the poles went together, how the rings went together. So that's where all the rest of the drawings you're going to see only squared off poles. However, couple points I wanted to make. First and foremost is the fact that we're talking about 10 amot, which is roughly 5 meters approximately. So we're not talking about a little pole. We're talking about a 2-story high pole, basically. And you have to also consider the fact that this is a solid wood. So the weight of these is approximated at somewhere between 950 and 1,000 kilograms. Okay, a ton, approximately a metric ton. A ton was what each of these weighed. That's without the gold coating. Now remember, they're also, all of the boards are plated with gold. Now there's a difference of opinion, as what else is new, right? As to whether they were plated on all 4 sides all around, or only on the front and back, but not along the sides where the walls, where they joined the walls. So in other words, the front was coated with gold, the back is coated with gold, but the 2 sides where you have boards coming next to one another was not necessarily plated, nor for that matter, according to one opinion, was the top. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it would have been very, very little gold needed on top. You only have 1 finger width. But again, according to Menachem, you've got a full amma there. So again, these are not light things. They're pretty solid and presumably would stand up to a pretty solid wind once they're all attached and put together. So we're not talking about, well, many people think, okay, it was a flimsy structure. It's not a flimsy structure. I just want to make that point. We're talking about solid wood here, and it's pretty well assembled, as we'll see as we go through the drawings here. Okay, the next point, the next drawing focuses on the yadot and the different possibilities. Rashi, again, which is the one that most people seem to go with, is that the pegs were rectangular in shape and offset from the ends of the Kerashim in both the vertical, in both the linear direction and the transverse direction. So both directions are offset. And if you'll notice here, he has a little quick diagram showing that in the front to back direction, there is, each of these has a 1/4 of an amma space, a 1/2 an amma of going downward, and then another 1/4 of an amma where it's chiseled, where it's spaced out. And then if we go along the width-wise, where each pole has 2 yadot, you'll see that it goes again a 1/4, a 1/4, a 1/2, a 1/4, and a 1/4 of an amma. Of each of these is the measurements. That's Rashi's opinion. There were a couple of other measurements. One is that they were rounded, not square. Of course, as I said, for everything you got to have at least 6 opinions. The book that I took all this from quoted 3. Abarbanel says no, that the yadot were next to the ends of the Kerashim, not for a third of the way in, not equally spaced as Rashi has them. Again, most of the Parshanim seem to follow Rashi's thing, and most of the artists follow Rashi's perspective, as we saw up with Art Scroll following Rashi's. But again, we see that the whole primary purpose of these is they have to be solid enough so that they will fit in the silver sockets and hold the poles steady. So they have to be pretty solid. That's why I think Rashi's makes the most sense, because they're thick enough in terms of the width and along the width of the Keresh to hold it solidly. Okay, we go next to the Adanim. Now again, Adanim, this is a solid box of silver. 2 different opinions, of course, as always. Again, obviously, according to the Barbanel, this is Rashi's. These are Rashi Adanim that we're looking at. Barbanel would have the holes much closer to the ends of the sockets, and according to, I forgot who the other opinion was, they would be circular holes in the middle, obviously, because you have to fit circular poles. You've got to have circular holes. And if you have, like Rashi, you have rectangular poles, you've got to have rectangular holes to fit them in. Again, these are solid silver. However, they're not necessarily solid. They may very well be just walls of silver and hollow, because we know that, again, if you measure the amount of silver, if these would be solid, it would weigh approximately somewhere in the order of a 1/2 metric, of 800 kilograms. If you had a box this size of solid silver. Again, the size here is 3/4 of an amma this way, 1.5 amma this way, and 1 amma tall. So that's a pretty solid box of silver. But again, the fact that it has a holes for the adanim lessens the amount of weight, and the fact that the Torah itself tells us that each of these boxes is fashioned from 1 kikar of silver only, because we know that they collected 100 kikar of silver. As we find in Parshat Pekudei, it tells us how much silver was collected for the Mishkan and how much of it was used for the Adanim. Each Adan was 1 kikar of silver, which is approximately 50 kilos in terms of weight, not 800 kilos of weight. So obviously these are not solid silver boxes. I mean, they're only made of silver, but they probably have hollowed out, not just hollowed out for the Adanim, but hollowed out in terms of their construction. So they're probably just a mold of this shape. And I'm not sure whether there's nowhere where it discusses the bottom, whether the bottoms were done or it was just the shape of, as you see, of the Adanim. So again, all of this, by the way, just so you know, the job of carrying and transporting all of these things that we're talking about today was the job of family of Merari, and that's why we find in Parshat Naso that they are allocated 4 of the 6 wagons that are donated to transport the Mishkan and all of its stuff. 4 of them go to Merari because they've got the heaviest stuff to transport, the heavy boards, the heavy sockets, and the poles. Okay, next we go to the Sinim. Now, this is part that's not really discussed in the Torah, but it seems that the Parshanim tell us that this existed, that there were little, in addition to all of the other attachment elements that the Kerashim had, they had 1 or perhaps 2 little pegs, and obviously on the opposite board next to them, there is obviously a hole for this little peg that's sticking out to go into. Now you'll notice that here's the hole in the middle for the middle pole to go into. That's a pole, but these are little pegs that attach to each of the boards to keep them attached to the pole they are joined to. Again, nowhere. It's alluded to in the Torah. Perhaps some of the Parshanim want to suggest, but there's nowhere where it's directly said that each of the poles had these pegs to align them with the pole next to them. So we're going to go past that. But by the way, you'll also notice here in this drawing, you can see it a little better, the fact that they have this little right here. If you look right here, I come with all these arrows here. You have this slight hole here, as we talked about before, for the rings. These are the holes that put the rings on top that hold each of them together. And if we look here, we will see the rings. Now, 2 different opinions on the rings. The general consensus opinion is that actually, let me make this a little bigger. On this one. There we go. Let's make this a little bigger so we can see this. Here we go. You'll notice here, this piece here is a square ring that goes into these little slots here. These are the 2 slots for the next one that hold the 2 poles together. This, by the way, is more of a hook-like thing, and this is Sforno's opinion that this is what the tabaot were. They were more of a hook that held the poles together. But the general consensus seems to be the tabaot, the rings were this, and that each of the poles had the rings, not just the corner poles, whereas Sforno seems to say this is what the corner tabaot looked like. Again, as I said, general consensus is these are the tabaot. As we saw above in Art Scroll, that there are these tabaot, rings of gold that are placed in these recesses here to hold the poles, again, tightly and solidly. And remember, all of this stuff is being made and has to, as David said, it's going to be challenging to get all this to fit together properly and line up. By the way, each of the poles is numbered, and it always goes in the same place. It's not like haphazardly, they're all 20 interchangeable, so let's put them together any way we want. Each pole was numbered, and each of the sockets was numbered, so that they would always assume the same location. Once you have gotten them lined up, I guess the first time you want to make sure that you did it. Kind of like when you build your sukkah, you got to make sure where you put which pole you put where, right? So this was a project, I'm assuming. Again, here you see the larger version of the slots for the rings that hold the tops of the poles together. Okay, next. Okay, now again, all of that was for the poles on the straight wall. The corner poles are a little bit different because they are holding a wall in two different directions. So you'll notice here, again, Rashi says, no, there were two different the corner rings were not much different than the others. There was a ring here and a ring here. This ring was a little bit longer, but that's about it. There was a space, a gap here between the two rings. There's another opinion that says no, it was one large rectangular ring that held both corner boards together rather than two separate rings. The reason that they say that is because, again, there is nowhere where it says that the corner pole had a different slot in it for a ring. That's why Rashi says no. That's why, I'm sorry, the opinion that doesn't agree with Rashi says no, it was a square ring that held this. The only ones that have the slots is here and here. Here are the two slots, and the rest of this is just to hold, just because there was nowhere else to put to make sure it held. Whereas Rashi says no, there were two regular rings, and this corner pole had a slot going in a direction opposite all the other slots. That's why it was a corner pole. It had a slot that went parallel to the slots on the other side wall, not the same direction that all the other rings on that wall went. I hope this is all clear, that I'm making sense. So, okay. Now here we see all of the three walls assembled. You'll notice again here, suddenly it's become gold. And you'll notice also that we see here at least only one shown, but here you see that there's going to be the poles here that hold the walls again together, stable also, provide again more stability in addition to the rings and the sockets all lining them up. Here are the poles that provide rings. Now we're going to talk about the poles. Okay. The poles. Now here is an assembled wall showing a line of boards. You'll notice they have the rings on top. You'll notice the poles being held together. Now here, this version shows that the poles themselves are coated gold and the rings do not cover the whole length of the board. So the pole itself has to be coated gold because the rings are only part of it. There's another opinion, as I said, that the rings really run from along the whole length of the board, and therefore it's only a wood pole being inserted, but the fact that all of the gold rings extend along the whole length of the board keeps it, makes it gold. And we'll see, hopefully we'll have a chance to see some of this in the text. Okay, now if we look at the different poles, now we have to get how we got to 5 poles instead of, no, we don't have that, that's the next one. Okay, so here you'll notice this discusses where are the poles along the height of the Kerashim. So Rashi's opinion very simply says that we divide, since there are 3 different sets of poles running through, one being the middle one, which is 1 pole. Now, here's how we get to 5 poles. There are each on the north and south side, there are 20 boards. So the first 10 are connected by 1 pole, which is 15 amot long. The second half are connected by a second pole, which is 15 amot long. There are 2 of those poles, one on the top, one on the bottom. So that's how we get to 4. The middle one, there's only 1. That's how we get to 5 poles. So that's how there are 5 poles on each wall. Again, on the north and south walls that have 30 amot, there are 15 amot each, the short ones, and 30 amot for the long one. On the western wall, the shorter ones are only 6 amot. Six, a little bit, what is it? 8, 12. Yeah, 6 amot long, and the long one is 12 amot long, because the western wall is the shorter wall. So again, from Rashi's perspective, they're equidistant from top to middle to bottom, so that the lowest set of these brichim is put at the 2.5 amot height. The middle one is drilled literally through the middle of the board at the 5 amot height, and the top one is at the 7.5 amot height. Now remember, The top and bottom ones are attached via rings. The middle one is attached by running, is not attached, it is inserted into a hole drilled or somehow, I don't know, they didn't have an electric drill going to make a nice strong, but somehow they managed to make these holes in the poles, and that's where this middle pole went through at the middle height and as drilled in the middle of each of the boards. Now, again, I talked about the fact that there's gold, that the poles were not necessarily gold. Again, there's an opinion that says the rings here are, in addition to the rings, here you see the rings being not just the ring that holds it, but the ring having a gold coating along the entire width of the board. Hence, the poles themselves did not need to be plated in gold, unlike the poles of the ark, unlike the poles of the shulchan, unlike the poles of the mizbeach, which are coated with the metal. These poles of the boards are not coated with metal. So that when they had disassembled this and they took it out, it was a plain wooden pole. The reason it's called coated in gold is because the gold rings enclosed them entirely. So you could not see the wood of the poles. You could only see the gold of the rings. And that's, I think, this. Now, Rashbam says, no, the reason it says there were 5 poles is because there were 5 poles along 5 different heights in addition to the middle pole. As I said, what we talked about before was Rashi's opinion. There were 2 sets of 2 and this middle one. But Rashbam's opinion is that there were 5 separate sets of poles along each one being the full length of the wall, and plus the middle one, which also was the full length of the wall, in addition to that. Okay, I think we're coming to the end of our pictorial section, and we can go back to our texts. One more. Okay, this is just a final picture showing the other one. Now, there are 2 opinions about this middle pole. One is what I just said, that the middle pole was the length, it ran along the entire length of each wall. There were 3 different middle poles. There's another opinion, this is an opinion brought down, which we'll see, I hope when we get to it, that there was 1 middle pole. It was 70 amot, was the length of the entire Mishkan. How did it get inserted? Great question, and the Midrash has to answer. The opinion that says there was only 1 of these says, well, it was miraculous. It was flexible wood. So you could put it in and it would snake its way through along 3 walls, doing 2 90-degree turns till it came to the other end and magically landed in place as it was supposed to. That's, as I said, Midrash. The literal sense of the text seems to imply that it was mina katzeh katzeh, from one end of the wall to the other. It was a full length pole for each wall rather than one for all 3 walls. However, as I said, there's the Midrashic opinion that says there was 1 for all 3 walls. And here we can see I wanted to have this second picture here showing you'll notice the bottom amma here is silver. Okay, that's the Kerashim, the Adanim. The top 9 is the poles themselves with all the supporting apparatus that assembles them. But remembering that this is the bottom amma is silver and the other 9 are gold. By the way, when the curtains are placed over this whole tent, you don't see any of this on the outside. You only see it on the inside when you happen to go into the Mishkan, because all of this outside area is going to be entirely covered by the 3 different covers that cover the Mishkan, which is not what we're going to talk about tonight. But that's just so you'll be aware that if you were standing on the outside of the Mishkan, you didn't see gold, you didn't see silver, you saw curtains. Okay, so with that, we've completed our visual aid. I hope it will help as we try to go through now some of the psukim and some of the parshanim. Okay, let's go to here. Let's go back to the text now. Of course, we start as usually with Rashi. Now, again, as I said, many of the pictures followed Rashi, but before we even get into Rashi's comment on the text itself, his first comment is really on 1 letter. It says, "V'asito et ha-kerashim," and you shall make the poles, the Kerashim, as we've said. Everything, everywhere else in parshat Terumah, where we are told to make something, it doesn't use the definite article hey the first time it introduces this. So, for example, when it introduces the aron, it says Yasu aron at Teshitim. They should make an aron, an ark. They should make a table. They should make altar. All of those are introduced with the indefinite article rather than the table, the altar, which obviously happens later. Now, the Kerashim are the only thing that are introduced as he thought ha-kerashim. You should make the pole. So Rashi wants to know, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Why does it start with the definite article of the poles here? As it says with everything else in the Mishkan, it does not use the definite article of the. Umal ha-kerashim. So what is the intent of ha-kerashim? Rashi quotes, of course, a wonderful medrash. Me'otan ha'omdim u'miyuchadim likaf. From the cedar, from the, I won't say cedar, shittim trees that were already prepared and set aside for this purpose. What does he do? He quotes the midrash, Yaakov Avinu, Patriarch Yaakov, Tzafa B'ruach HaKodesh. He saw prophetically that the Jews were going to have to build a Mishkan when they left Egypt. V'nata arazim b'Mitzrayim. Therefore, he planted arazim, which generally do not grow in Egypt. Yaakov planted them in Egypt, presumably in Goshen or somewhere in the neighborhood. Ukeshemet, when Yaakov was on his deathbed, Siva levanav lahalotam imohem k'sheyetzu miMitzrayim. He commanded his children to make sure you take these trees with you when you leave. Now, I don't know how tall they were when they left, but after 210 years, they probably had a little growth on them. Now, remember, we just said that each of these poles, when they were after they were shaved down and shaped and whatever, still weighed probably close to a ton. So imagine how much the trees weighed before they started shaping them. So they were pretty heavy, and presumably they had to carry them when they left Egypt. Torah hasn't mentioned this at all. This is purely medrash. However, if we think about the fact, hey, they're in the middle of the desert, where did they get all this wood? The silver, the gold, we can understand where they got them because we've read about how when they left Egypt, they all took silver and gold. How when the Egyptians drowned on the sea, they found all this treasure on the sea. We understand that. But how did they get this wood? That's a critical question. And Rashi is quoting this midrash that offers an answer. Amar Lahem, Yaakov says to his children, again on his deathbed, Hashem is going to ultimately command you to make a mishkan when you're in the desert. Me'at say shitim, from shitim wood. Make sure you take all of these shitim wood that I planted, take it all with you, because you're going to need it all. That's what he said. And he quotes one of the piyutim, which I wasn't able to find, but it says, Mizurazim korot batenu arazim, that when Yaakov went to Egypt, he already was prepared. He prepared all of the arazim that would be needed. So these trees were all ready and prepared before they left. Now, then it says, Atzei shitim omdim. These are Atzei shitim trees that are omdim, that are standing. What does that mean that they're standing? Omdot, what does that mean? Sheyehei orach hakarashim zakuf lemala b'kirot hamishkan. That the trees, as they are growing, that becomes the height of the Mishkan. The lotasak talim b'krashim shochavim liorochav hakrashim legov talim keresh al keresh. We should not think that the construction of the Mishkan is like ordinary construction. If you ever see a picture of a log cabin, now in a log cabin, when you build a log cabin, you don't put the logs vertically, you put them horizontally, one on top of another, and you attach them and you connect them through plus some type of mortar and some type of nails and spikes and whatever you use to attach wood to wood. That's exactly what the word omdim here is to tell us, that that's not the way this is to be constructed. This is not to be constructed log upon log upon log, but it's supposed to be board next to board, as we saw in all the in the drawings. That's why it says omdim. Okay, Eser amot orach hakarash, each was 10 amot in length. Rashi tells us lamadu shegavo shemishkan eser amot, that teaches us the height of the Mishkan was eser amot. And again, he says that the chama v'chatzi amah tells us the actual measurements of the inside of the Mishkan. Arko shemishkan lesin Kerashim, which is shloshim amah. that the length of the Mishkan on both the north and south side, from which ran from east to west, was 30 amot. And again, later on, he'll tell us that obviously, since there were 8 boards along the side, 8 boards comes out to 12 amot along the western wall, of which it was only 10 was internal, 2 covered the thickness of the outer planks, so they were external to the inside area. So the inside area was only 10 amot, even though the wall was 12, because it had to cover 1 amma of thickness on either side. And then Rashi explains how the yadot, these tenons, were made. He says, the bottom of each pole had to be carved out. The emtza'o begova amo, in the middle, up to an amma height, because that was how high the adanim were. Again, it leaves a little bit of space on either side. And that is how we get these 2 yadot. They are part and parcel of the wood. They're not something that is made separately and attached later on. They are carved out of the wood. And these yadot had to be entered into the adanim, which were hollow, into a hollow space in the adanim that was specifically designed to hold the yadot. The adanim gavan amma, the yoshvim mitzupim arbaim ze'etzel zeh. The adanim were 1 amma tall, and they sat next to each other. Okay, so if you think of an amma, you think half a meter. They were pretty solid little guys. I mean, you look at the pictures; they seem like they're very short, but they're rather tall. I mean, if you think about a foot and a half in terms of English measurements or American measurements, or I think Canadian, they're metric. I don't know. You guys are metric or still English, still imperial? I still. So so you think a foot and a half. That's a rather significant height. That's probably up to, I guess, I don't know, your knee or plus, a little bit higher than your knee. So they're not they're not like little brick size boxes here. And so they sat 40 along one another along the longer walls. The adot were carved on all their sides. Because if they were not properly carved, you would find that the Kerashim did not exactly line up. If they had not been properly carved and the tolerances were not met, they would not have fit in the holes properly to make sure that the poles all aligned one next to the other. And also so that Shechasa Kerashim called Rosh Aden, and also that it had to be a proper so that it would fit in all the way, and also that not just one pole next to next, but the pole had to lie flat on the top of the silver socket. Had to lie flat also. So that was another line that had to be straight, so that there was no space between the silver, because it was, like the floors we have here, where your table doesn't sit straight because it's not flat. They had to be perfectly flat also. Okay. And the same thing in terms of the height. They had to all fit. And that's why it says, they have to be signed up. They have to line up perfectly, both below and above. Okay, now Rashi explains these yadot are asuyim kamin shlivo tzulam. They're like the pegs, the steps on a ladder, and how they attach to the sides of a ladder. So in other words, you have a peg that you insert into the side of the ladders. And he says, so too, these handles, these yadot, were there to be inserted to hold it tight. Okay. All right. I think that's enough with the Rashi. Let's get to, because we're running late here, so we'll skip the rest of the Rashi, because there's really not much here. Again, just describing the design that we've seen already in the pictures. Okay. Chamisha. Now, why Rashi again talks about the 5 poles that attach the walls, that attach the poles to each other. Elu chamisha shloshahen. Rashi says the 5 poles are really only 3, as we've seen. The top and bottom ones were 2 separate pieces. One went from the west to the middle of the wall. The other went from the east to the middle of the wall. And therefore there were 2 separate pieces. On the western wall, obviously, one from the south to the middle, the other one from the north to the middle. Each one entered the ring from the proper appropriate side. Until their two heads reach each other. So we see, since there was a top one and a bottom one, each of two halves, that's four. But the middle one that went through, not into the rings, but through the pole, arco keneged kol hakotel, viad kotsehu. The middle one was as long as the entire wall and went from one end to the other, as we said. Okay. We'll leave the rest of this Rashi out, but that's just to give you where Rashi's point of the five things. And okay. Now Rashi also adds just one thing that we need to remember. That Rashi wants just to make sure you understand that the poles and the rings that held the poles were on the outside of the Mishkan, not on the inside where the furniture was, not where the space that was worked. So, in other words, they were on the northern wall, they were further to the north. On the southern wall, they were on the southern side. On the western wall, they were on the western side of the wall. They were on the outer side of the wall, as I said, completely covered by the curtains. And on the inner wall, all you saw was flat wall, complete gold, I guess, the whole way, except for the one little bottom, which was silver. So the rest of the way, so when you walked and you were looking in the Mishkan, presumably most of the height was, you saw gold. Again, obviously the bottom, you saw that little, I guess, I don't know, up to your knee strip of silver, but the rest was all gold. Okay, I'm going to skip most of Ramban here because we're much later than I thought we would be. There was one point I wanted to make. The Ramban makes the one point that I think I did talk about earlier. Okay. Okay. The Charetz this was for the rings up top, that there needed to be a hole. Okay. We'll leave Ramban. Okay. Chizkuni. Chizkuni has a very interesting comment. Rashi said the word Atzei Shitim Omdim, that they have to be standing cedar wood trees, Shitim wood trees. I keep doing that. Is to tell us that they had to be in an upright position and in the way they grew. Chizkuni says, no. In addition to that, ate shitim noflim. Don't take ate shitim that already were old and worn out and had been, had died and were lying around. That had been cut down a long time ago. Don't take old, used, worn out wood. That's already starting to go bad. You have to take them from those that are standing and still really attached to the ground. You really got to cut them off as shortly as possible, or as closely as possible the time you're going to use them. They also have to be cut the way they grow. Now, there's a lesson he wants to teach us. Also, the Torah, by using shitim wood, tells us, very important thing, don't use wood from fruit trees that are producing fruit, because they're there to produce fruit. Hashem gave us trees to use for construction. We should be using only those trees for construction. We should not be using trees that are still productive and still able to produce fruit for other purposes. Very interesting comment on Chizkuni, obviously. Okay. I'm going to skip this also. I'll get to Klei Yakar here very briefly. Okay. Now, Klei Yakar, again, quotes the same midrash that Rashi quotes that we had before. Kerashim Behei Hayidiyah. He's saying basically the same question Rashi has. Why the Kerashim? These are the same arazim that Yaakov planted in Egypt for them. But he says, now he's very interesting. Siman l'davar. What's the hint that tells us these were Yaakov planted them? Because if we take Hakarashim LaMishkan, the numerical value of the term Hakarashim LaMishkan, with that hey, Olel Mispar, you get the same gematria as Yaakov Avinu, Natalem Arazim Mitzrayim. Ancestor Yaakov planted them Arazim in Egypt. What? Now, hey, it's not just enough that they equal numerically. The mispar of both of them is Titrat Seh, 1,095. By the way, I checked the gematria. And it works. 1,095. But that word comes out to Titrat Seh. He Amar Yaakov LaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yaakov said to Hashem, Bamet titratzeh al maseh egel. How will Bnei Yisrael come back and achieve favor before you after the Cheda Egel? Now, Yaakov, this is all midrashic. Yaakov sees in the Nevuah that there's going to be a Cheda Egel, and he asks Hashem about it. Okay. And Hashem says, through Atzei Shittim, they will be able to achieve atonement. Now, why are they called Atzei Shittim? Lechaper al shtut maseo egel, as an atonement for the foolishness of the Cheda Egel. And they will help achieve a kapara before Hashem. And similarly, he brings them to Terumah. Okay, now another midrash, Kliyakar quotes. Why does it say Atzei Shittim omdim? These are Atzei Shittim that stand. She'omdim le'olam, that they are eternal. This wood is eternal. That it lasts forever, which again is according to a midrash that says all of the non-usable items in the Mishkan that were, when the Beit HaMikdash was built, all the items they no longer needed were hidden away. Okay, where they're hidden, great question. Someday, when Har HaBayit is excavated, we may get to them, but I don't know. I suspect they're probably wherever you'll find the Aron somewhere, that's a whole different discussion. Lomer sheyichotam atzeshitim omdim muchanim lechach. Kizeh mashmaut ha-lashon omdim v'armei mekomot. Omdim means something that is ready and set aside for a purpose, and there is really what it means here. That these atzeshitim omdim, these are the atzeshitim that were previously set aside for this purpose. Although, again, he quotes the Midrash that they will survive forever, and he quotes into whole Midrash. We're going to skip the rest of this, even though it's very interesting things, so my time is up. But I do want to end with one thought. The word Kerashim and Keresh appears, by the way, in the Torah, in Tanakh, a total of 51 times. 50 of those are referring to our Kerashim. 23 in this week's parsha, 23 times in parshat Vayakel, a couple times in parshat Pekudei, and a couple times in parshat Naso, where it talks about carrying them. But basically, in the Torah, the word Kerashim or Keresh or HaKerashim or Likbla Kerashim, whatever, appears 50 times, all of them referring to the Kerashim of the Mishkan only. The 51st time that this word appears in Tanakh is in Yechezkel, where it's describing the destruction of Tzor, how Hashem is going to destroy Tzor, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to wipe out this city, and Hashem is going to destroy it completely because of their participation and their animosity toward Israel. But that's a bit different. And there, the word Keresh means rudder, as in a ship, rudder of a ship. So I thought it's very interesting that the only other time it's not that this word appears is as a rudder, which is something that steers us. And I think that's really the reason that I think is a link to the Mishkan. The purpose of the Mishkan is to set us up, to steer us in the right direction, especially as we just saw after the Cheda Egel, it's to steer us and to keep us on the right path. So I hope this was interesting to all of you. I hope we get a better idea through the pictographics, what the Kerashim looked like, what the Mishkan looked like, and we should all hopefully be able to experience not necessarily what the Mishkan looks like, but what the Beit HaMikdash looks like speedily. Thank you all. Any questions, comments, feedback at this point? Rita.
Yes. Why is it necessary to write all this stuff in the Torah?
Why is it necessary to write all this stuff in the Torah? That's a great question. And tonight's year I didn't really address that, but I will tell you that if you go through, for example, Ralbag, Malbim, Samson Raphael Hirsch, they will go through each of the minute details, each of those three go through the minute details of this whole construction project, not from the materials that are used, from the details of the menorah, to the details of the Aron, to the details of the Kerashim, and give you a rationale, a lesson for every one of these things. And they come up, by the way, there's very little overlap. I mean, there's not a whole lot of overlap between what Malbim says and what Hirsch says and what Ralbag say. They don't necessarily come to the same conclusion. They each look at these in different ways and go through all the minutia of the Mishkan and reach different conclusions as to what the symbolism of all of this stuff is and why the Torah had to include it. Now, there were other Parshanim who just say, well, the Torah included it because it wanted us to have the blueprint. And it's interesting because if we go through the Haftorah that we're going to read this Shabbat, which is parshat Terumah, is at the end and is in the middle of describing Shlomo building the Beit HaMikdash. And there's a lot of description of that. And then if we go to the Navi Yecheskel, there's a whole description of some future Beit HaMikdash, whether it's talking about the second Beit HaMikdash or the future one that will be built when Mashiach comes. There's a whole discussion among the Parshanim in Yecheskel. But the fact is, the Torah, there are three different places where the Torah goes through the Torah, and I say two, one in Torah and two in Navi, where the Torah goes, where the Torah or the Navi goes through great length to describe what seems to be architectural design. And I think there's, as I said, each of the Parshanim, some of the Parshanim just say, okay, that's just the way it is. And others say, no, this is here because there's a symbolism in each and every item here that the Torah mentions. As I said, didn't do that today. I didn't get into any of the symbolism of all of this stuff. That's a whole different story. But clearly, as I said, that's one reason. The other reason is just so we should understand what this Mishkan was built for and how much expense it took, and yet everybody was willing to give, and they gave generously, so generously that Moshe had to say, "Hold it, stop giving." Unheard of thing in fundraising business. I know there's no such thing as you stop giving, he gave too much. But Moshe had to tell people to stop bringing stuff for the Mishkan because they had enough and they had nowhere to do, nothing to do with the surplus. So I think that it's a great question. And the even greater question, by the way, Rita, is, okay, that's fine that it listed it once. Why does the Torah go through everything twice? Because we're going to, in 2 weeks, we're going to go through the same thing, 3 weeks, we're going to go through the same thing again in Parshat Vayakhel, which is basically, most of it, a large segment of Parshat Vayakhel is a carbon copy, almost verbatim, of Parshat Terumah. That's a whole different question. But as I said, the reason the Torah gives us this, I think, is so we should have an understanding of what the Mishkan looked like, and so that we can understand what length they went to beautify and glorify the place where they were going to meet Hashem. And I think there's a lesson for us when we're that in terms of that the place that we set aside to commune with Hashem specifically should be a place of kavod. I think that's a very important lesson from this whole story of the Mishkan, clearly, among others. But that's I hope that helps. Any other questions, comments, feedback? Okay, thanks you all for joining. Have a good rest of the week, and B'ezras Hashem, we'll see you again the next week. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.